Welcome to the third video in our four-part award-winning series on building a D3 Scatterplot project. The first video we looked at the design of the project, the data set we were doing, and we looked at the D3 version 5 notion of loading data with a thing called promises. The last video we looked at scales, and there was a lot of tinkering work that we did in that video, but it's going to pay off here because in this video, we'll look at axes, and we will see that building axes is actually tremendously simpler because we've done our work with scales. D3 has four kinds of axes that we can use and that we can attach to data visualizations. If you're just looking at the names, you might think that the names position the axis somehow, but it doesn't. So of left, right, top, and bottom, all that means to D3 is on which side of the line should the tick marks go? That's all it means. So it's common, of course, to use, say, an axis left on the left-hand side of data viz. We'll do that today. It's common to use axis bottom at the bottom end of data viz, and we'll do that today too. But there's no rule about that. And in fact, when we're working with axes, there are really four things that we have to do, that we have to tell D3 about. So number one, obviously, is just choose one of these. And we will tell D3 which scale to use for that particular axis. And there are some really convenient consequences to that. We'll see those in just a second. And then it's up to us manually to append the axis to the SVG and then to do any final positioning on it. And we'll see that again here too in just a second. Building an axis is actually surprisingly easy. So here, for example, is how we build an axis left. We just tell D3 to build one. And the other thing that we do importantly, crucially, is that we give the axis a scale. And what the scale does is it tells D3 exactly how big to build that thing. And there are a couple of really interesting consequences for this. One of the things I'd like to point out is it's tempting here to think of our variable y-axis as the object itself. But in D3 it really isn't. It's actually really a function. And so when we position the axis, we'll need to call that function. When we build axes in D3, it almost seems like there's a little bit of magic happening. It almost seems like it can read our minds. But I just wanted to stop for a moment and explain exactly how D3 can build axes as intuitively as it does. So here's a common typical axis, but D3 knows exactly to the pixel how long to make that, because we sent a scale to the axis, and the scale has a range. And if you remember from the last video, the range is a number of pixels in the SVG grid. So all D3 needs to do is to look at the range, and it knows exactly how long to make that axis. Same for the tick marks. Because the scale has a domain, D3 just looks at the domain, and it sees the sort of range or the span of all of the elements in the domain. It can choose how many tick marks might be appropriate, and it even knows how to label them because it's simply pulling values out of the domain. So D3 is actually very, very smart about this, and this is one of the reasons that it's useful to spend all of that time tinkering with scales, because the scale delivers a ton of information to the axis. All right. So let's position it. Here at the top again, we're building a y-axis. We're sending it a y scale. That scale is giving a ton of information to this new axis. And again, remember, y-axis is a function. It isn't the scale itself. It's just a function. So what we need to do next is we need to append it to the SVG element. So I'm just using D3 select. I'm selecting my SVG container. And I'm now appending a group. And if you remember from any work that you've done with SVG, the group is just a series of SVG elements. So lines, tick marks, circles, squares, text, anything. So we're creating a group, and I am going to give that group an ID. I'm just going to call it y-axis. Now, in the long run, I want to grab the axis again later. So I'm just cutting to the chase here. I'm going to give it an ID. We could also put some attributes on here too, by the way, of class, and we could do a couple of those. So this is a way not only to find the axis later, but I can hang some CSS stylization attributes here as well. And then finally at the end, I'm going to call the y-axis function, and that's actually going to draw it on the screen. Now, if you've worked with SVG groups before, you know that if I don't tell JavaScript where to put that, it's going to put it at the origin of the SVG container, 0, 0. And in fact, something really similar happens here, which is this. D3 knows how to position the axis vertically because it uses the range of y-scale to figure that out. But there's nothing in y-scale that tells D3 where to position that axis along the x coordinate. So that's the thing that we need to do. We just need to tell D3 to slide this axis over to the right a certain number of pixels so that it's positioned properly. And we can do that here with another attribute. We're going to apply the transform attribute, and remember, transform can do a bunch of things. It can skew things, it can scale things, it can rotate things, and all we want to do here is to translate the thing. Now, I know, everybody took Latin, I know, but translatus means literally to carry across. So translate really means carry. So what we want D3 to do in this moment is to carry that axis 75 pixels along the x coordinate, but translate it 0 pixels in the y coordinate. So we're just moving it to the right 75 pixels. Now, I think in the last video we were about 70 or so. I don't even like 75. We're going to tinker with that. Okay, but here's the deal. That 75 is not going to be hard-coded down here. It's going to be a constant or a variable, and we'll see that when we look at the code here in just a few minutes. The x-axis is exactly the same thing. So here I'm creating axis bottom, and I send it the proper scale, x scale. That tells D3 exactly how long in terms of pixels to make it, because it looks at the range, and it tells it how many tick marks we should have and how to label them, right? So D3 is going to make its best decision there. Now, of course, if we didn't like how D3 did that, we can manually override it, but I'm going to be honest with you, in this example, I'm going to be totally fine with what it's doing. Same thing here. So when I build that x-axis function and I append it to the SVG container, D3 doesn't really know where to put it. It knows exactly how long to make it because there's a range, knows about the tick marks because there's a domain, so it can make some guesses. But because that SVG container, that new group, has not been given a position, it can only put it at y equals 0. And so we'll get an axis at the top exactly like this. So of course what we need to do is we need to push it down to the bottom a little bit. And so we're going to add here too another transform attribute. We're going to translate or carry that 0 pixels in the x direction because it's already positioned properly left to right. And we're just going to push it down the y coordinate about 525 pixels. And again, that's not going to be hard-coded. We're going to be able to calculate that. It's going to be the total height of the SVG minus what we think of as the padding at the bottom, etc., etc. Same thing, I'm going to give this an ID. I'm going to call it x-axis because later I'm going to want to grab this again. And we'll see why shortly as we start to run some code. And here's that code. So let's take a quick tour and then we'll see how this gets built in the website itself. So you'll see now here up at the top in my global variable section, I've added a few new things. I've got a variable x-axis, y-axis, lines 17, 18. And you'll see that from the last video, I have started to take all of those hard-coded numbers that we were working with, and I have built those into JavaScript constants up here. So you can see the SVG height is 600, padding left and right, or left and bottom, sorry, 75, 30 on the sides. My domain padding, remember we added 10%, that's 0.01. So any of those things that are hard-coded numbers, I am pushing them up here to the top and I'm making variables out of those. All right, so let's scroll down. We'll take a look right here in my load file function. Remember, this is what gets called as a callback function and event handler every time I change the data set. So you can see here at lines 49 and 50, I'm building new scales based on what that new data set is. And then at 51, 52, I can't count today. This is where I'm building the x-axis and building the y-axis. And instead of doing them right here in the then clause, I'm pushing those out into some functions, which are down here in my axis section. This is exactly what we were just looking at in the little slideshow. So I'm building an x-axis, D3 axis bottom, sending it the x scale, and I'm appending that as a group to the SVG container. The only thing that's a little different here is that I'm actually in line 103, I'm concatenating together a translate string. So instead of hard coding that into the attribute on line 108, I'm actually building it. And you can see what I'm doing. I'm doing a little bit of math here. So we wanted to push that x-axis down 525 pixels. So I'm just figuring out what that is. I'm taking the total SVG height, which is 600, and I'm subtracting backwards the bottom padding, which was 75 pixels. So 600 minus 75 is 525, and so when JavaScript concatenates that string together, that will turn into translate 0, 525. At line 113, I'm doing the same thing with the y-axis. I'm building a translation string there as well. So there I'm translating towards the right the amount of left padding I had, which was also 75 pixels, and I'm translating in the y-coordinate 0. So at line 114, I'm just concatenating together a translation string, but the same process here. I create axis left, I append or attach the y scale to that new axis, I hang it as a group on the SVG container, and I apply a transformation. That's all there is to it. Let's see how it works. So I'm just going to scroll over here. We'll go into our age of parenthood. I will reload this page just to make sure that the library has been loaded properly. And watch what happens now if I choose a data set. I get my Yaxis. Oh, brilliant. They're positioned exactly where we've mathematically assigned them to, and you can see that that Y scale is great. Look at the ages 14 up to 40. That looks fantastic. D3 is figuring out where to put the tick marks on its own. That's brilliant. Look at the bottom. It's not really how I want a year to appear. D3 doesn't know that those are years, and so D3 just thinks that that is 1,565. Well, okay. That's a very easy fix. I'll show you how to do that in just a second. So let's try to load a different data set and see what happens. Let's go to the next one, 1600. Oh, this is an interesting puzzle. All it does is append the new Yaxis on top of the old ones. It doesn't get rid of the old ones. And I'm sure if I go to the, yeah, there it is. All right. So what we need to do here is to translate from the first axis into the second axis and translate that into the third. So that's just going to be a transformation, and this is exactly the reason why I gave both of these axes an ID, so that I can grab them and force them to transition. Now in the code, it makes sense that this is what would happen, because all I'm doing is every time I load a new data set, I create a new axis and I append it to the SVG container. So even if I pick an older data set here, like we already did this one, but I just added yet one more set of axes on top of this SVG, it just draws right on top of what we had before. So it looks like it's invisible, looks like nothing's happening. But every time I choose a new data set, I'm actually appending a new axis to the SVG container. So let's fix that. New code. Notice now that in both my functions, build x-axis, build y-axis, those functions are now if-else conditionals. In short, what I'm doing is I'm asking to see if that axis already exists. So at line 105, I'm checking to see if the x-axis exists. Remember that exclamation point in JavaScript means not. So that says if there's no such thing as a variable called x-axis, then go ahead and build it just like we were building before. You might have noticed there's one new line. I'll show you that in a second. Same thing down here for the y-axis. I'm checking to see if the y-axis already exists. If it doesn't, I'm building it and hanging it on the SVG container. But if those conditionals prove false, I do something different now. All I need to do to transition that axis is to attach a new scale. So this is the way that this logic will work. If the x-axis already exists, that means that it got loaded with a previous data set. If we load a new data set, the first thing we do is build new scales, new x scales, new y scales. So here at line 115, I can assume safely that there is a new x scale. So I take the existing x-axis and I just swap out for the new scale. Now, instead of appending a group to the SVG container, what I would like to do instead is select the x-axis itself. That hashtag, remember, means ID. It's a CSS selector. I am going to apply a transition, that duration, an animation in other words. That duration of that transition will be 500 milliseconds. There's 1,000 milliseconds in a second, so that's going to be a half a second long. And then I call the x-axis function, which redraws the axis. Same thing down here for the y, right? So just absolutely parallel. So if I have an existing y-axis, I attach the new y scale. Same thing. I select the y-axis element. I transition for a half a second as I call the new y-axis function. Great. The one thing you'll notice that I did add is when I build the x-axis for the first time, I am applying a tick format function. Now, there's a little bit of a callback there called format as year. Rather than do that hard-coded down here, I've put that now up at the top of my code as a function. So format as year is a D3 formatting function. Now weirdly, I think this is a little counterintuitive. We send a string, if you've ever worked with this in like databases or PHP or Python or Ruby, there's all kinds of things for formatting dates and formatting numbers, and there are all these weird arcane strings that I can never ever remember. I can't remember these in D3 either, so just Google these and you can figure out what you need. In order to get rid of that comma in the year, the formatting string is really actually a zero length string. That's all it is. So this is a little callback function. It says to take that number, format it into this proper structure. A zero length string means get rid of the commas. Google it, or you can figure it out on your own, right? So down here, back in my function, when I'm building my x-axis, for the very first time, I am creating an axis bottom. I'm applying the current x scale to that axis, and then I tell it, for your tick marks, please use that formatting convention as a way to structure that, right? If I want to change that structure later, it's up at the top. I can tinker with it up at the top. All right. Well, let's go back and try it again in our code. All right, sorry, in our website. So again, I'm going to load, reload. By the way, when I'm working on this, sometimes it retains the old library. If you look in your Python weblog, you'll get a code 304 sometimes, and 304 says, don't load this because you already have it. So sometimes you have to do things like just flush the cache. And so in Chrome, I just go, under Chrome to clear browsing data, and I can clear that out. So sometimes you'll have to do that. I just thought I would mention it. All right, well, let's give it a spin. So I'm going to choose a data set, and now I'm doing the first one, 1550, 1599. That's great, exactly the way that it was before. Well, let's try it with a new data set. That's exactly what I want to have happen. So every time now that I choose a new data set, the axes are shifting and transitioning, they're scaling on their own, right? And if I go back, perfect. This looks great. So it's even kind of animated. That's really nice. Now, one of the things you'll notice, this is actually, I think, kind of cool. Right now I'm at 1600 to 1624. If I want to go backwards to 1550, on the timeline, all of those dates are to the left of my current axis. So what will happen is that the new axis will slide in from the left, because intuitively, that's where it would be on the number line. There you go. If I go forward 1625 on the number line is to the right, so you'll notice now that the new x-axis will slide in from the right, like that. Great. One last item before we end this video. Now that I've got my axes going, I kind of don't like where I positioned them, but it's easier now to tinker with the layout of my SVG because everything is up here at the top. So you'll notice that I've changed the left padding and bottom to 65 pixels, and I've actually added a little bit of padding on the right and the top. We also, if you remember in the last video, we added about 10% of the space to the domain, and I just didn't like that. I just thought now, as I see it, it's too much. So I've reduced that to 5%, and I omitted it before from the top right corner, but now that I look at it, I think it's a little crowded up there. So you'll notice what I did is in the domain, I subtract it from the left-hand side of the x-axis, and now I'm actually adding it to the right-hand side, and I'm also doing that down here in the y-axis. So I'm subtracting from the bottom, so it gives me a little leeway on the bottom, but I'm now adding it back to the top. So I'll make sure that I save that, and let's take a quick look at it and see if I like that a little better. Reload this page, and if I knew my data set now, yeah, I kind of like where that occurs better, right? I just think I like the position of that in the framework a little better. And then I can start to play with some dots. Remember, we were playing with that before. So if I want circle, let's say 1600, 15.3, now the least possible point that I have in that data set is going to occur right there. I think that's great. It's not sitting on top of the axes. There's just a little bit of space there, but it doesn't look weird in any way, and I think I'm okay with that. And likewise, if I go for the biggest element, it's this one. The biggest element in that data set is going to occur right there. So I think that now I've got some better space here. I just like the layout of that better. But obviously, if I decide later tomorrow or a week from now, all those numbers are up at the top, and I don't have to go diving into the code again. I can just change it at the top, and everything will be fine. One more thing before we let the axes go. It's always a good idea to put some labels on your axes. So I've done that. So you see now as we choose a data set, I have a label down here at the bottom, year, and one on age on the y-axis. And if I change my scales, you see that those remain and those stay. So I'll just show you the code on that one really quickly. Here in my load file, this is the callback function, the event handler for changing a data set. And you'll notice down here, now at line 55 and 56, I have called a new function called add labels. I've put that down here in my axis section. And you can see what I'm doing. I'm just selecting the SVG container, and I'm appending a text SVG element and assigning it year. And you can see on year, I'm just translating it over 290 right on the x-axis, 580 down. How did I get those numbers? I just tinkered with it till I found something I liked. The y-axis is a little bit different, is its age, but you'll see that I'm not only translating it over to the right 30 pixels, down 300 pixels, but I'm also rotating that text 90 degrees counterclockwise. I will probably put some of those numbers up top so that, as I said, I don't like those to be hard-coded, but I'll work with that later. All right, well, that's all we've got for axes. So in the next video, we're actually going to really start plotting data on here, and we will work with some of the interactivity there, those checkboxes on displaying men and women properly. All right, thanks, and good luck.